The wrench was still in my hand when my phone lit up at 11 o'clock at night. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a busted carburetor from old Pete Garland's truck, the kind of small work I brought home sometimes just to keep my hands busy. The house was quiet the way it always was now. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. The kind that settles in after someone who used to fill a room stops filling it. I had the radio on low, some late country station out of Columbus, and the overhead light was buzzing the way it had been buzzing for 3 months, because I kept forgetting to change the bulb. June would have changed it herself by the second day. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. I almost let it go. Telemarketers don't quit even at 11, and I wasn't in the mood for a recorded voice trying to sell me something. But something made me pick up. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now. Some instinct that had nothing to do with logic. Mr. Tillman. The voice was young, male, shaking bad enough that I could hear his breath catching between words. This is Marcus. Marcus Webb. From the shop. I set the wrench down on the table. Marcus, what's wrong? I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else to call. He stopped. I could hear him breathing, trying to steady himself. You need to come to the shop tonight. Right now if you can. But Mr. Tillman, please don't call Danny first. Please don't tell him you're coming. The kitchen felt different after he said that. Same buzzing light, same cold carburetor on the table, same quiet house, but different. Son, I said slowly. What's going on over there? I can't say it on the phone. I'm sorry. I know this is strange. I know you've got no reason to just drive out here on my word. But I've been working for you for 2 years, and I've never asked you for anything. And I'm asking you now. Please come. The line went dead before I could say another word. I sat there for a moment, looking at the blank screen. Marcus Webb had started with me 2 summers ago, fresh out of high school. Didn't know a torque wrench from a socket set, but willing to learn and honest about what he didn't know. That last part mattered to me more than anything. I had fired men twice his age for less honesty than that boy showed me in his first week. In 2 years, he had never once called me after hours. Never once asked for a favor. He showed up early and left late and said yes, sir, and no, sir, and meant it. I put on my coat. The drive to Tillman's auto took 11 minutes on a normal day. At 11 at night, the streets were mostly empty, just the occasional set of headlights coming the other way. The gas station on Route 9 lit up like always. A couple of kids outside the convenience store on Maple huddled against the cold. November in Ohio doesn't ask permission. It just arrives and reminds you that summer was a long time ago. I turned onto Granger Street and slowed down before I even reached the lot. There was a light on inside the shop. That wasn't unusual. Danny sometimes worked late or said he did. What was unusual was the truck parked at the side door. A dark blue pickup I didn't recognize. Backed up close to the entrance the way you'd park if you were loading something heavy and didn't want anyone on the street to see you doing it. I pulled into the lot slowly and killed my headlights before I reached the front. Through the big plate glass window, I could see them. Danny was standing near the front counter with his arms crossed. Sheila was next to him, talking fast the way she always talked when she was making a point she'd already decided on before the conversation started. There was a third person I didn't know, a heavy-set man in a dark jacket, holding something that looked like a folder or a contract. I sat in the car for a moment and watched. They didn't see me. The lot was dark, and I had come in quiet. Danny said something, and the man in the jacket nodded and reached out to shake his hand. Sheila smiled, Not the smile she used when she was happy. The other one. I got out of the car and walked to the front door. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my key. The same key I had been carrying for 35 years, worn smooth on one side where my thumb always rested. I slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, slower, the way you do when you think maybe you just rushed it. Still nothing. The key went in clean, but it had nothing to catch on. The lock had been changed. The lock on the front door of my own shop. The shop I had built from a 2-bay garage with a leaking roof and one hydraulic lift that worked only when the weather was above 40 degrees, had been changed without my knowledge, without my permission, and without a single word to me. I stood there in the cold with my key in my hand. Inside. Danny laughed at something the man in the jacket said. Sheila touched Danny's arm the way she did when things were going her way. Neither one of them looked toward the window. I did not knock. I did not call out. I stood on the concrete step in front of the door of my own business, and I felt something move through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger and in some ways worse. The feeling that the ground you thought was solid had been hollow underneath you for longer than you knew. I walked back to my car and sat down behind the wheel. I didn't drive away. I just sat there with the engine off, watching the light through the shop window. And I let the memories come the way they do when you're tired enough to stop fighting them. Tillman's Auto started in 1989 with $4,000. A handshake from a man named Gerald Pruitt, who owned the property and was willing to take monthly payments instead of a lump sum. And June standing beside me in the parking lot on the first morning, saying she believed in me with the kind of certainty that made you feel like belief was a physical thing you could put in your pocket and carry around. I was 28 years old. I knew engines. I had been taking things apart and putting them back together since I was 11 years old in my uncle's driveway in Dayton. And somewhere along the way, I had figured out that most mechanical problems were not mysterious at all. They followed rules. They left evidence. If something was broken, the reason was always there in the parts if you looked carefully enough and were patient enough to look. I built the business the same way I fixed engines. Slowly, carefully, without shortcuts. By the time Danny was born, we had 4 bays and 2 full-time mechanics. By the time he started school, we had added a small waiting area with a coffee machine and a television, and June had painted the walls herself. A warm yellow she picked out from a hardware store sample book on a Saturday afternoon, holding the little cardboard squares up to the window light and squinting at them the way she squinted at everything she was deciding about. She was like that about everything. She thought things through. She didn't rush. She saw people clearly, maybe more clearly than was always comfortable for the person being seen. She saw Danny clearly. She loved him. I want to say that plainly because it matters. She loved our son the way a good mother loves a child, completely and without conditions. But she saw him too. She saw the way he moved through the world looking for the angle, the easier path, the outcome that cost him the least. She used to say it quietly, not as a criticism exactly, more as an observation she couldn't quite let go of. She'd say, "Roy, that boy of ours, he's always looking for the door marked exit." She wasn't wrong, but I told myself it was just youth, that he'd grow out of it, that time and responsibility would sand down the rough parts. I told myself a lot of things about Danny over the years. June got sick in the spring 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already settled in and made itself at home. By the time we knew, we had maybe 8 months. We spent those 8 months the way you spend time when you know it's running out, paying attention to the small things you had been walking past for years. The way the kitchen smelled in the morning, the sound of her laugh at something on television, the particular way she stacked the shoe boxes in the hall closet, saving every receipt, every warranty card, every folded instruction sheet. Because she said you never knew when you'd need to prove something. She died on a Tuesday in January, early in the morning when the light was just starting to come through the bedroom curtains. After that, the house got quiet in the way I described, and I got smaller inside it than I had ever been in my life. Danny came around more after June passed. I noticed that, and I was grateful for it. Or I told myself I was grateful for it, which is not quite the same thing, but is sometimes close enough to feel like the real article. He brought Sheila to Sunday dinners. He called during the week. He asked about the shop, how things were going, whether I was keeping up with everything all right on my own. It was Sheila who first mentioned the idea of combining resources. She brought it up at dinner one Sunday in March, about 2 months after the funeral. She did it the way she did most things, not directly but from the side, like she was just thinking out loud and the thought had nothing to do with her. She talked about the car wash business, how it was growing, how the margins were good if you had enough volume, how she and Danny had been looking at a second location, but the capital was the sticking point. Then she looked at me with that smile of hers and said, "You know, there might be a way to structure something that would benefit everyone." I should have listened to the word structure. People who are doing something straightforward don't usually call it structured. But I was lonely, and Danny was my son, and the house was too quiet, and June wasn't there to squint at the idea and hold it up to the light. We signed the papers in April. Danny's lawyer drew them up. I didn't bring my own. I told myself it was family. And family didn't need lawyers sitting across from each other at a table like it was a negotiation. I put in $40,000 from my retirement account and signed a partnership agreement that gave me equal standing in a new joint business entity. Danny shook my hand after. Sheila hugged me. She smelled like expensive perfume and something else underneath it that I couldn't name. Driving home that evening, I had a feeling I didn't examine too closely. A small, cold feeling. The kind your body produces when something is wrong but your mind isn't ready to agree yet. I turned the radio up and told myself it was just nerves. That change always felt uncomfortable at first. That Danny was my son, and you had to trust your son. I parked in the driveway and sat in the dark for a minute. The house was quiet. June's shoe boxes were still in the hall closet, stacked the way she'd left them. I walked past them on the way to the kitchen, like I did every night. I didn't stop, but I looked at them. The first few weeks after we signed the papers, nothing felt wrong exactly. That's the thing about a slow betrayal. It doesn't come at you all at once. It comes the way rust comes, quietly, in the places you're not looking. And by the time you can see it, the damage is already deep in the metal. Danny started coming by the shop more often, which I took as a good sign. He'd show up mid-morning, walk the floor, talk to the mechanics. He had never shown much interest in the actual work of the place. The engines and the diagnostics and the specific logic of figuring out why a machine wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. But I told myself that was fine. People bring different things. Maybe his strengths were on the business side, organization, planning. The parts I had always handled by instinct and a yellow legal pad. Sheila handled the paperwork for the new joint entity from her home office. That was the arrangement we'd agreed on. She had a head for numbers, Danny said. She'd worked in accounts management for a medical supply company for 6 years. She knew how to structure things. There was that word again. Structure. But I let it pass. By the 3rd week, I noticed I wasn't being copied on the emails. It started small. A message from the supplier about a change in pricing. A note from the insurance company about updating the policy. Things that came to Danny's address because that's how Sheila had set up the accounts. And when I asked about it, Danny said he'd forward everything. It was just easier to have one central point of contact. He didn't want me dealing with the administrative headache on top of running the floor. I said that was fine. I had run the floor by myself for 35 years without it being a headache. But I said it was fine. The next thing was the schedule. Sheila came in one Thursday afternoon with a printed sheet. A new weekly schedule for the shop's operating hours. She had extended the evening hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays and added a half day on Sundays. I looked at it and pointed out that my senior mechanic, a man named Carl who had been with me for 11 years, had a standing arrangement about Sunday mornings because of his church obligations. Sheila looked at me with a patient smile, the kind of smile that is shaped like kindness but has something else behind it. She said, "Roy, we need to optimize for revenue, not for personal preferences. Carl is an employee. He doesn't set the schedule." I said Carl was someone I had made a commitment to, and commitments mattered to me. She looked at Danny. Danny looked at the floor. That look. Danny looking at the floor. I would come to know that look well over the following weeks. It was the look of a man who had already decided something and was waiting for the conversation to end. The Sunday hours stayed on the schedule. Carl came to me privately the following week and told me he understood if things had changed. He said it with the dignity of a man who has been disappointed before and learned not to make a scene about it. I told him his arrangement stood and that I would handle it. I don't know if I believed myself when I said it. About a month in, Sheila suggested I take some time away from the floor. She brought it up on a Wednesday evening when she and Danny had come for dinner. She had started doing that, coming for dinner, filling the quiet house with conversation and the smell of whatever dish she brought. Always something she'd made herself, always presented with the warmth of someone doing you a favor. I had started to look forward to those evenings more than I wanted to admit, which I understand now was part of the design. She said, "Roy, you've been running that shop alone for a long time. You've earned a rest. Danny and I can handle the day-to-day for a while. You could take some trips. See your brother in Cincinnati. You don't need to be there every morning at 7. I said I liked being there every morning at 7. She tilted her head slightly. She said, "We've noticed you sometimes repeat yourself. Little things. Forgetting where you put the invoices. Danny mentioned you called a customer by the wrong name last week." I looked at Danny. He was looking at his dinner plate. I had not called any customer by the wrong name. I knew every customer by name. I had known most of them for decades. Knew their cars, knew their families, knew which ones paid on time and which ones needed a gentle reminder and which ones I'd been carrying on credit for years, because they were good people going through hard times. Getting names wrong was not something I did, but I didn't say that. I said, "I appreciate the concern." Sheila smiled. She said, "We just want what's best for you. You should take it easy. Let us handle things. You just rest. Dad." She had never called me Dad before that night. It sat wrong. I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing you feel before you can name it. Like when an engine sounds almost right, but there's a frequency underneath the normal sound. Something slightly off in the timing. And a man who has been listening to engines long enough knows the difference between almost right and right. I drove home that night with the heater running and the radio off. I thought about what she'd said. Forgetting things. Repeating himself. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn a part in your hands looking for the crack. I wasn't forgetting things. I wasn't repeating myself. I was 63 years old, and my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. And I knew it. But I also knew that if someone says a thing like that gently enough and often enough, and if the person they're saying it to is tired and alone and doesn't have anyone at home to tell him what's real anymore, the words have a way of getting in through the gaps. I sat in the driveway for a minute before going inside. The light over the garage was on. June used to leave it on when I worked late so I could see the keyhole. I had kept it on out of habit every night since January. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went inside. Marcus Webb found me on a Saturday morning at the diner on 5th Street. I had been going there for breakfast since before he was born. Corner booth by the window, coffee black, eggs over easy, wheat toast. The waitress there, a woman named Patty who had worked that counter for as long as I could remember, always had my order in before I sat down. It was one of the small, reliable things that still felt the same after June. And I held on to it the way you hold on to small, reliable things when the larger ones have come apart. Marcus came through the door at 8:15 and stood in the entrance, scanning the room. He was 20 years old, lean and serious-faced, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned early to pay attention to his surroundings. When he spotted me, he walked over and stopped at the edge of the booth. He said, "I'm sorry to bother you outside of work. Mr. Tillman." I told him to sit down and have some coffee. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the mug Patty brought him and looked at it for a moment before he looked at me. There was something working behind his eyes, a calculation about how much to say and in what order, the way a person looks when they've been rehearsing a conversation and aren't sure the rehearsal covered everything. I said, "Take your time, son." He nodded. He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 2 weeks. I kept thinking maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe it was none of my business. But then last Thursday happened, and I decided I had to tell you." I set my coffee down. "What happened last Thursday?" He took a breath. He said, "Mrs. Tillman. Sheila. She came in while you were out making the parts run. She had a man with her I'd never seen before. He had a clipboard and he was walking the floor, looking at the equipment and writing things down. Not like a customer, like he was assessing the place. He went into the office and spent about 20 minutes in there with the door closed. When he came out, he shook Sheila's hand and said something about comparable properties, and she said something back about timing, about wanting to move before the end of the quarter. I didn't say anything. Marcus kept going. He said, "I asked Carl about it after they left. Carl said he'd seen the same man there the week before, on a day you weren't in. Carl said he didn't ask because he didn't want to cause trouble, but he said it felt off to him too." I looked out the window at 5th Street. A pickup truck went by with a dog in the bed, ears back in the cold. A woman pushed a stroller past the hardware store across the way. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked on a Saturday morning in this town, which made what Marcus was describing feel strange and far away and very close at the same time. I asked him what else. He hesitated. He said, "There's the thing with the parts account." He explained it slowly, the way he'd clearly been organizing it in his head. The shop had a trade account with a regional parts supplier, Hendricks Auto Supply, which I had held for 22 years. The account was in the shop's name and had always been managed directly by me. About 6 weeks ago, Marcus had taken a delivery from Hendricks and noticed the invoice had a different account number than the one he'd been using on the purchase orders. He'd mentioned it to Danny, thinking it was a clerical error. Danny said he'd look into it and told Marcus not to worry about it. Marcus had worried about it. He had written down the old account number and the new one. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and put it on the table between us. I looked at the two numbers. They were different in 4 digits. I said, "Do you know whose name is on the new account?" He said, "I called Hendricks on my lunch break. I told them I was following up on a billing question. The woman I talked to said the account had been restructured 2 months ago. She said the primary account holder was now listed as a business called DS Auto Holdings, LLC. DS. Danny and Sheila." I folded the piece of paper and put it in my shirt pocket. Marcus was watching me. He looked young sitting there across from me. Young and worried, with the expression of someone who has done a thing he believed was right and isn't yet sure how it will land. I thought about what it had cost him to come to me. He was 20 years old, and Danny was his employer of record now, at least on paper. And loyalty in a situation like this was not a simple or a comfortable thing. I said, "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight." He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Because you gave me a chance when nobody else would. I applied at 4 shops before yours, and nobody called me back. You called me back the same day. You showed me things. How to listen to an engine, how to read a diagnostic, how to treat a customer. You never once made me feel stupid for not knowing something." He paused. He said, "And because what they're doing isn't right. I don't know all of it yet, but I know enough to know that." I looked at him across the table. I thought about what June used to say about paying attention to who shows up for you and who doesn't. She said you could know a person's whole character by watching what they did when the easier choice was to do nothing. Marcus Webb had chosen the harder thing on a Saturday morning in November and driven to a diner on 5th Street to sit across from a 63-year-old mechanic and tell him the truth. I thanked him. I told him to keep doing his job and not to change anything in his behavior at the shop. I told him not to tell anyone he had spoken to me. He nodded and stood to leave. Then he stopped. He said, "There's one more thing. That man with the clipboard, the one assessing the shop. When he left, I heard him tell Sheila the timeline looked workable. He said, assuming the current occupant vacates without complications, Current occupant. I was the current occupant of a business I had built with my own hands over 35 years. Someone was already describing me as an obstacle to be cleared. I sat with that for a long time after Marcus left. Patty refilled my coffee without being asked. The diner went on around me, the Saturday morning noise of a small town living its life. And I sat in my corner booth and felt something shift inside me that had been loose for weeks, finally clicking into a new position. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder than panic and more useful. I didn't sleep well that Saturday night. I lay in bed with the ceiling fan going, the same one June had insisted on because she always ran warm, and I stared at the ceiling and turned the pieces over in my mind, the way I turned engine parts on my workbench, one piece at a time. What did it mean? Where did it connect? What was the thing underneath the thing? DS Auto Holdings, LLC, a property assessor, current occupant. By Sunday morning, I had decided to check the joint account. We had set it up in April when we signed the partnership papers. It was supposed to be the operating account for the new combined business, the account from which shared expenses would be paid and into which shared revenues would flow. Sheila had handled the setup. She had brought the paperwork to the shop on a Tuesday, and I had signed where she indicated. I had put in $20,000 as the initial operating contribution, separate from the $40,000 I had moved into the partnership investment. Danny had matched it, supposedly. I drove to the branch on Henderson Avenue when it opened at 9. The teller was a young woman I hadn't seen before. She pulled up the account when I gave her the number and looked at her screen for a moment, with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that people in service jobs learn to make their faces neutral when the news is not good. She said, "The current balance is $412. I said. "I'm sorry," she said it again. $412. I asked her to print me a statement of transactions for the past 60 days. She printed it and slid it across the counter in a manila envelope without making eye contact. I took it to one of the small tables by the window and opened it. The account had held just over $38,000 as of 6 weeks ago. In the 5 weeks since then, 17 individual withdrawals had been made. They ranged from $800 to $4,000. All of them had been made at ATMs or through online transfers initiated from a device I did not recognize. The last one had been made 3 days ago. $200, as if whoever was doing it had wanted to leave just enough in to keep the account from closing automatically. I folded the statement and put it in my jacket pocket. I sat there for a moment with my hands flat on the table. Outside the window, Henderson Avenue was quiet. A few cars. A woman walking a small dog. The Sunday morning stillness of a town that was still deciding whether to wake up. Everything looked ordinary. Everything felt like it was happening at the wrong speed. I called Danny from the parking lot. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular texture of a man who has been awake for a while, but doesn't want you to know it. "Hey, Dad." "What's up?" I said. "I'm at the bank. I need you to explain the joint account to me." A pause. "Not long. Just long enough." He said, "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean there's $400 in an account that had $38,000 in it 6 weeks ago, and I'd like to know where the money went." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "Roy, I was going to talk to you about that this week. There were some operational expenses that came up. Equipment. Some advance payments to contractors for the new location build-out. I should have kept you better informed. I know that. And I'm sorry. It's been moving fast." I said. What contractors? What build-out? We haven't agreed on a second location yet. He said, Sheila found a space that's perfect. It was now or never on the lease, and we had to move. I know it should have been a joint decision. I hear you. But Roy, the opportunity was real and the timing didn't allow for a long conversation. This is exactly the kind of thing she's good at, seeing the moment and moving on it. You've got to trust the process a little. Trust the process. I looked across the parking lot at nothing in particular. I said, Danny, I want to see the invoices for these expenses. All of them. The contractor agreements. The lease. Everything. He said, absolutely. Of course. I'll have Sheila pull everything together this week and we'll sit down and go through it. You have every right to see all of it. This is your business too. His voice was warm and reasonable, and slightly tired in the way that people sound when they are managing you. I had heard that particular combination before in my life. Not often, but enough times to recognize it. It was the voice of someone who has decided on an outcome and is working backward from it, making the conversation feel like it's moving forward while making sure it arrives exactly where they need it to arrive. I said, this week, not next week. He said, this week. I promise. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the bank statement in front of me. $412, $37,600 gone in 5 weeks through transactions I had not authorized and had not been consulted about. I was listed as a co-owner of the account. My name was on the paperwork. And yet the money had moved as if I did not exist. I thought about calling a lawyer. I picked up the phone twice and put it back down. I told myself I was waiting for the invoices Danny had promised. I told myself there might be an explanation. I told myself that the charitable reading of a situation was always worth trying first. The truth was something smaller and harder to look at. The truth was that some part of me was still hoping I was wrong. Still hoping that the picture I was assembling from the pieces in front of me was not the picture it appeared to be. Still hoping that my son was not the thing the evidence was suggesting he was. That hope was not wisdom. I know that now, but it was real, and it was mine. And I held on to it for a few more days, the way you hold on to a thing you know you're going to have to set down. That evening, I walked past the hall closet on the way to the kitchen and stopped. I looked at June's shoeboxes for a long moment, stacked neatly on the shelf, a dozen of them at least, each one labeled in her small, precise handwriting: utilities, auto, insurance, shop receipts, shop supplier agreements. I reached up and took down the one labeled shop receipts. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it next to the bank statement. Then I went back and got the one labeled shop supplier agreements. Then the one labeled auto. I made a pot of coffee. I sat down, and I started at the beginning. June kept receipts the way some people keep journals, not obsessively, not in a way that took over the house or made visitors uncomfortable, just steadily, quietly, the way she did most things. Every time money changed hands for something related to the shop or the house or the two of us. The paper record of it ended up in one of those shoeboxes, labeled and stacked and organized with the same patient precision she brought to everything she decided mattered. I used to tease her about it. I'd say, June, nobody's ever going to audit our grocery receipts from 2003. She'd smile and say, Roy, the point isn't that someone will ask. The point is that if someone asks, you'll be ready. I thought it was a quirk, the endearing kind, The kind you stop noticing after a while, the way you stop noticing a person's particular laugh or the way they hold their coffee cup. Sitting at the kitchen table that Sunday evening, I understood for the first time that it wasn't a quirk at all. It was wisdom. It was a woman who had spent her life watching the world carefully enough to know that the truth almost always lived in the paperwork, and that the paperwork almost always lived in the place nobody thought to look. I started with the box labeled Shop Receipts. Inside were 35 years of the shop's life in paper form. Purchase orders, supplier invoices, equipment warranties, parts receipts going back to the early 90s, some of them handwritten on carbon paper, the kind that came in duplicate books before everything went digital. June had kept them all, organized by year in labeled manila envelopes, each one sealed and dated in her handwriting. I wasn't looking for anything specific yet. I was just looking, getting my bearings, reminding myself of the shape of things as they had been before April, before the papers were signed, before the quiet erosion began. It took me about an hour to notice the first thing. The Hendricks account. The regional parts supplier Marcus had mentioned at the diner. I found the original account agreement in an envelope from 2001, the year I had switched from a smaller local supplier. The account number was printed at the top of the agreement. I wrote it on a piece of paper and set it next to the account number Marcus had given me. The new one registered to DS Auto Holdings, LLC. They matched on the first 6 digits and diverged on the last 4. A small difference. The kind of difference you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. The kind of difference that meant the account had been quietly transferred without the primary holder, meaning me, initiating or authorizing the transfer. I moved to the box labeled Shop Supplier Agreements. Inside, I found the original signed agreements for every major account the shop held. Hendricks, the lift maintenance contract, the shop's commercial insurance, the business license renewals going back to 1990. June had kept them all. I found the insurance renewal from March of this year, 2 months before we signed the partnership papers. I found the one from this past September, 6 months later. I put them side by side. The coverage was the same. The property address was the same. The named insured had changed. In March, it read Roy M. Tillman, DBA Tillman's Auto. In September, it read DS Auto Holdings, LLC. I sat back in my chair. The insurance on my shop had been changed to reflect a business entity that hadn't existed when the policy was last legitimately renewed. Someone had contacted the insurance company and changed the named insured on a policy I had held for over 2 decades. And they had done it without my knowledge, without my signature, and without telling me it had happened. I got up and poured my coffee out and made a fresh pot because the first one had gone cold while I was reading. I stood at the counter while it brewed and looked out the kitchen window at the dark backyard. The rosebush June had planted along the fence was bare now, just brown canes against the November dark. But in June it put out yellow flowers the size of my fist, and she used to cut them and put them in the blue pitcher on the windowsill. I thought about her. I thought about what she would say if she were sitting at that table right now, watching me work through this. She wouldn't say I told you so. She wasn't built that way. She would just sit there with her coffee and her patient eyes, and she would wait for me to arrive at whatever I needed to arrive at. I went back to the table. I opened the box labeled Auto. This one held the records for the truck. The old Civic I had sold 3 years ago, and the car June had driven. Registration renewals, oil change receipts. The insurance cards she kept paper copies of even after everything went electronic. There was also, near the back of the box, a plain white envelope with my name on it in June's handwriting. Just Roy. Nothing else. I held it for a moment. I didn't open it. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because I wasn't ready. Maybe because whatever was inside it had been waiting long enough that it deserved to be opened at the right time, and this. Sitting alone at midnight, with the kitchen light buzzing and the November dark pressing at the windows, didn't feel like the right time. I set it to the side. I would come back to it. I kept working through the boxes until 2 in the morning. By the time I stopped, I had a stack of papers on one side of the table and a yellow legal pad on the other, with a column of dates and numbers and notes in my handwriting. The picture they made together was incomplete still, but it was beginning to have a shape. One number kept appearing in different forms across different documents. A figure that showed up in the withdrawal pattern from the joint account. That appeared in a payment authorization I found dated 6 weeks ago that I had not signed or approved. That corresponded, almost exactly, to a debt collection notice addressed to Danny at my shop address that had arrived in my mail in September, and that I had set aside at the time without fully registering what it was. $43,000. I wrote it down on the legal pad and circled it. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I knew it meant something. I slept 4 hours and was back at the kitchen table by 6 in the morning. The yellow legal pad was where I had left it, the circled number staring up at me in the early gray light. $43,000. I made coffee and sat down and picked up where I had stopped. Because the thing about following a paper trail is that it has a pull to it. The same pull a diagnostic has when you're deep into a problem and the answer is close. Just one more connection away. Just one more piece that will make the rest of it make sense. The debt collection notice I had set aside in September was from a company called Meridian Recovery Solutions. It was addressed to Daniel R. Tillman at the shop's address on Granger Street. I had assumed at the time that it was some kind of billing error, the kind of misdirected mail that turns up occasionally when a business has been at the same address for decades. I had set it in a pile on the counter and forgotten about it. I read it carefully now. It was a third-party collection notice for an outstanding balance of $43,200. The original creditor was listed as Premier Lending Group. The account had been opened 18 months ago and had gone to collections after 4 consecutive missed payments. The notice requested immediate contact to arrange a repayment schedule and warned of potential legal action if the balance was not addressed within 30 days. The 30 days had passed in October. I wrote Premier Lending Group on the legal pad and put a question mark next to it. I went to my laptop and searched the name. Premier Lending Group turned out to be what the financial websites called a non-traditional lender, which was a polite way of saying they charged interest rates that a traditional bank would not be permitted to charge, and they specialized in short-term loans to borrowers who could not qualify for conventional financing. Their average customer, according to one review site, was someone who needed cash fast and was not in a position to be particular about the terms. I searched for Premier Lending Group plus the word gambling, just to see what came up. The third result was a consumer complaint forum. I read through several of the posts. The pattern was consistent. Borrowers who had run up debts at casinos or through online betting accounts and needed to cover losses quickly before someone found out. Short-term loans at high interest rates, sometimes exceeding 40% annually, balances that grew faster than the borrowers expected, collections that followed. I sat back and looked at that for a while. Danny had never mentioned gambling to me. Not once. not a word. But I thought back over the past 2 years, and I began to see things I had looked at without really seeing. The way he always seemed slightly behind, slightly stretched, always just on the edge of some financial pressure that he never quite named. The expensive clothes and the new truck that seemed like more than his salary should support. The way Sheila's whole energy in April, when she proposed the partnership, had been slightly too urgent, slightly too bright. The energy of someone solving a problem that had been pressing on them for a while. I pulled out the partnership agreement. It was 12 pages, printed on heavy stock, with the law firm's name across the top. Danny's lawyer, a man named Freed who had an office in the newer part of town. I had signed it on page 11, my signature next to Danny's in the space provided. I had signed 3 other places as well, initials only, on pages 4, 7, and 9. I had not read pages 4, 7, and 9 carefully when I signed them. I had skimmed them. Sheila had been there, pointing to the signature lines, talking about the exciting possibilities of the new venture. And I had been signing with the particular inattention of a man who believes the person handing him the pen is on his side. I read page 4 now. It was a section titled, Additional Collateral and Security Provisions. The language was dense and full of subclauses, the kind of legal writing that is designed to be technically readable while being practically incompenetrable to anyone who hasn't spent years working with such documents. I read it twice, slowly. On the third read, I found the sentence. It was buried in a subclause on the second paragraph of the section. It read, in part, that the undersigned secondary party acknowledges and accepts joint and several liability for all existing and future obligations of the primary business entity, including but not limited to debts, loans, and financial instruments entered into prior to or subsequent to the date of this agreement. Joint and several liability. I knew those words, not from legal training, just from life. From enough years of watching people sign things they didn't understand and finding out later what they had agreed to. Joint and several liability meant that if the primary party couldn't pay, the secondary party was on the hook for the full amount. It meant that Danny's debts, the $43,000 he owed to a predatory lender that specialized in covering gambling losses, could now be collected from me. From my house, from my shop. I set the partnership agreement down on the table. My hands were steady. I noticed that. They were steady in the way that hands sometimes get steady when the situation has become serious enough that the body stops wasting energy on reaction and puts it all toward function. I had not understood what I was signing on page 4. I had initialed a provision that made me personally responsible for a debt I had known nothing about, incurred for reasons I had never been told, by a son who had sat across from me at that table and told me this was a good thing for both of us. I thought about April, the warm day, the handshake after, Sheila's perfume, and the thing underneath it I couldn't name. I knew what it was now. I picked up my pen and turned to a fresh page on the legal pad. I wrote Danny at the top and underlined it twice. Then I started listing what I knew, not what I suspected, not what I felt, what I could put on paper with a document behind it. By the time I stopped, the list was 11 items long. I looked at it for a moment. Then I got up, went to the hall closet, and reached for the next shoebox. The next shoebox was labeled Miscellaneous Documents. June had used this one for the things that didn't fit neatly into the other categories. Extended warranties, the deed to the house, the title to the truck, Social Security cards in a small envelope. The kind of documents you needed rarely and urgently at the same time. The kind you were grateful existed somewhere specific when you needed them, near the bottom, beneath a folded copy of our marriage certificate and the paperwork from when we had the roof redone in 2014. I found a manila envelope I did not recognize. It was sealed. No label. My name was written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Neat and professional. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who handles paperwork for a living. I opened it. Inside were 3 pages, stapled together, printed on the same heavy stock as the partnership agreement. At the top of the first page, in the same font as the law firm letterhead I had seen before, were the words, Personal Guarantee and Loan Indemnification Agreement. I read it. I read it once quickly, and then I went back to the beginning and read it again slowly. The way you reread something when you are hoping the second reading will produce a different result than the first. It did not produce a different result. The document was a personal guarantee. It stated that I, Roy M. Tillman, in consideration of certain business arrangements entered into on the date specified, did personally and unconditionally guarantee the repayment of a loan in the amount of $43,200 issued by Premier Lending Group to Daniel R. Tillman, and that in the event of default by the primary borrower, the full outstanding balance, including accrued interest and collection fees, would become immediately due and payable by the guarantor, meaning me. And that said, repayment obligation was secured against all personal assets of the guarantor, including real property. My house. I turned to the last page. At the bottom, in the space marked Guarantor Signature, was my signature. My name in my own handwriting, with the date written beside it. April 14th. The same day we had signed the partnership agreement at Danny's lawyer's office. I sat very still. I looked at my signature for a long time. I knew my own handwriting the way you know the sound of your own voice. There was no question it was mine. The particular way I made the capital R, the way the 2 L's in Tillman ran together slightly. It was my signature on a document I had no memory of signing. April 14th. I thought back to that day in careful detail. The law firm's conference room, the long table, Sheila across from me with the partnership papers arranged in a neat stack, pointing to the signature lines, talking. Danny beside her, quiet, hands folded. I had signed multiple documents that day, multiple places. Sheila had managed the process, sliding pages across the table, indicating where to sign, where to initial, keeping the conversation moving so that the whole thing felt like a formality. A pleasant conclusion to a decision already made. I had not read everything I signed that day. The personal guarantee must have been in the stack, placed there deliberately, indistinguishable from the other documents in weight and appearance, waiting for my signature in the same way the joint and several liability clause on page 4 had been waiting. 2 layers of the same trap set on the same day by the same hands. I set the document on the table in front of me, my house. The house I had bought with June in 1993. The one we had painted and repaired and filled with 30 years of a life built together. The house where Danny had grown up, where June had died on a Tuesday morning in January. It was collateral on a gambling debt I had guaranteed without knowing it. On behalf of a son who had sat beside me at that table and watched me sign my own exposure into the record without saying a word. The kitchen was very quiet. I thought about Danny at 8 years old, the summer I had taught him to change a tire in the driveway of this house. He had been patient that day, more patient than I expected, following each step carefully, wanting to get it right. I remembered thinking that patience was a good sign in a person, that a child who could be patient about something difficult would grow into a man who could be trusted with difficult things. I had been wrong about that. Or maybe he had been a different boy then and had grown into a different man than the one I had imagined. I didn't know which was sadder. I folded the personal guarantee and placed it with the other documents on my side of the table. The list on the yellow legal pad now had a 12th item. I looked at the total picture laid out before me. The joint account drained of $38,000. The shop's insurance transferred to DS Auto Holdings, LLC, without my authorization. The parts supplier account quietly moved to the same entity. A property assessor walking my floor. A buried liability clause in the partnership agreement. And now a personal guarantee on a gambling debt secured against my home, signed on the same day as everything else. While Sheila kept the conversation moving and Danny kept his eyes on the table, it had been planned. All of it. Not impulsively, not in a moment of desperation. Planned carefully, with legal documents and professional assistance, by people who had decided that the most efficient way to solve their financial problem was to transfer it to a 63-year-old widower who trusted his son and had not brought his own lawyer to the table. I got up and went to the window. The street outside was empty in the early morning. The neighbor's oak tree had lost most of its leaves, and they were piled against the curb in brown drifts. The sky was white with November cloud cover, the kind of sky that can't decide between rain and staying dry. I stood there for a while. Then I went back to the table, picked up the white envelope with my name in June's handwriting, and held it in my hands. Not yet. I set it down again. I wasn't ready, but I was close. I picked up the legal pad instead and turned to a clean page. At the top, I wrote one word, how, not what they had done. I knew what they had done, how I was going to answer it. I sat down and started writing. I sat at that table until the light outside changed from white to gray to the particular pale yellow of a November afternoon. I did not write much on the legal pad after I wrote that word. How? I wrote it and then I put the pen down and I sat with the question instead of trying to answer it immediately. Because some questions deserve to be sat with before you start talking back to them. What I was really sitting with was something harder than strategy. I had been asking myself all morning what they had done to me. That was the easier question. The answer to that one was already on the legal pad in 12 numbered items, documented and cross-referenced, as clear as a diagnostic printout. But there was another question underneath that one, quieter and less comfortable, and it had been growing louder all morning while I was busy looking at documents. What had I done to myself? Not in a self-pitying way. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I am not a man who goes in for self-pity, never have been. and I wasn't starting then. But there is a difference between self-pity and honest accounting, and I had spent enough of my life doing honest accounting on machines to know that you couldn't fix a problem without first being accurate about how it started. The problem had not started in April. It had started the January before, the morning June died, and it had been building in the quiet of the house every day since then. I had been lonely in a way I did not have language for. June and I had been together for 38 years. 38 years of someone knowing where you were, knowing when you'd be home, knowing the specific way you took your coffee, and which news stories made you angry, and which ones just made you tired. When that stops, the silence isn't just quiet, it's a presence. It has weight and temperature, and it follows you from room to room. I had been carrying that weight for 12 months when Danny started coming around more, and I had wanted it to mean what I wanted it to mean. That is the honest truth. Danny called, and I heard concern in his voice, and I chose to hear concern because I needed someone to be concerned. Danny brought Sheila to Sunday dinners, and I was grateful for the company, because the alternative was eating alone in a kitchen where the only sound was the buzzing overhead light I kept forgetting to change. When they proposed the partnership and Sheila smiled across the table, I signed the papers not just because I believed in the business opportunity, but because signing them meant Danny was going to be around, meant I was going to be part of something, meant the house wasn't going to be quite so quiet quite so much of the time. I had handed them the door because I was lonely, and I needed it to be a door worth opening. That was on me. Not the fraud, not the forged documents, not the personal guarantee buried in a stack of papers while Sheila kept the conversation moving. Those were on them, and I was not going to take responsibility for their choices. But my own choice, the one I made in April in that conference room, when I didn't bring my own lawyer, when I didn't read every page, when I let the warmth of the occasion override the part of me that had been fixing other people's mistakes long enough to know that warmth is sometimes a technique. That choice was mine, and I had to look at it clearly. June had seen Danny clearly. She had loved him clearly and seen him clearly at the same time, which is harder than it sounds and which I had not managed. I had loved him in a way that required not seeing certain things, and that kind of love, the kind that needs the other person to be something they're not in order to function, is not really love in the end. It's need wearing love's clothing. I had needed my son to be trustworthy more than I had looked carefully at whether he was. That was the thing I had gotten wrong. Not the only thing, but the root of the rest of them. I sat with that for a while without trying to make it feel better than it was. Then I picked up the pen, because here is the other truth, the one that lived on the other side of the hard accounting. Knowing what you got wrong is not the same as being defeated by it. A mechanic who misdiagnoses an engine doesn't close the shop. He looks at the actual problem, the real one, and he starts again from an accurate place. You cannot fix anything from a position of self-deception, but you can fix almost anything from a position of honest understanding, if you're willing to do the work. I was 63 years old. I had built a business from $4,000 and a handshake. I had raised a son, buried a wife, and gotten up every morning for 35 years and opened the shop and done the work. I was not a man who needed to be rescued by anyone. And I was not a man who was going to let shame about a mistake I had already identified keep me from correcting it. I picked up the pen and I started writing on the legal pad again. Not the word how this time. Something more specific. I wrote Walt's name. Walt Greer, who had been my friend since we were both young men working at the same garage on the east side of Columbus, before I had the shop, before either of us had much of anything. Walt had retired from his own place 2 years ago and spent his time fishing and complaining about his knee and answering the phone on the second ring whenever I called. Below that I wrote Dana. Dana Pruitt, no relation to Gerald who had sold me the property. A woman in her early 40s who worked the commercial accounts desk at the branch on Henderson Avenue. She had helped me set up my business account 20 years ago when she was new, and I was one of her first customers. And we had exchanged pleasantries across that counter ever since. Below that I wrote a name I had not thought about in several years. Arthur Gaines. A man who had brought me his Lincoln Continental every spring for an oil change and a general inspection for as long as I could remember. Always paid on time. Always said thank you as if he meant it. He had retired from practicing law about 3 years ago. 3 names. Ordinary people. People who knew me and whom I had treated well over the course of a long, ordinary life. Not because I expected anything back, but because that was how I believed in operating. I looked at the 3 names. Then I looked at the 12-item list. I thought about what June would say. Watching me sit here with these 2 pieces of paper, I thought she would say, "Roy, you already know what to do. You've always known what to do. You just needed to be still long enough to hear it." I folded the legal pad open to the page with the 3 names and put it in my shirt pocket. I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, put on my coat, and picked up my keys. It was time to stop sitting in the house and start moving. I called Walt first, because Walt was the easiest call to make. Not because the conversation would be easy, but because Walt Greer was the kind of man you didn't have to explain yourself to before you got to the point. We had known each other for 37 years, long enough that the preamble had worn away, and what was left was just 2 men who knew each other's business and didn't waste time pretending otherwise. He picked up on the second ring. Like always, I said, "Walt, I need to talk to you about something serious," he said. I figured that was coming. "Come over." I drove to his house on Clement Street, the one he had lived in since before his kids were born, a brick ranch with a workshop out back where he spent most of his time since retiring. He was standing in the workshop doorway when I pulled up, coffee in hand. Wearing the same canvas vest he had been wearing since approximately 1997, I sat on a stool at his workbench and laid it out. All of it. From April to the personal guarantee to the insurance policy to the property assessor walking my floor. Walt listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. He had the mechanic's habit of letting a problem fully present itself before forming an opinion about it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You got a lawyer?" I said I had someone in mind, but hadn't called yet. He said, "Call Arthur today. Don't wait." Arthur Gaines is retired, but he's still licensed, and he still picks up. He did my brother's estate 2 years ago, and he didn't charge him a dime over what was fair. He said it slowly. With the weight of a man giving advice, he means seriously. Then he said something else. He said, "Roy, I want you to know something. You are not stupid for trusting your son. You are not naive for wanting it to be different than it was. You are a decent man who got taken advantage of by people who counted on you being decent. That's on them, not on you." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. But I held on to those words in a way I hadn't expected to. I drove from Walt's house directly to the bank branch on Henderson Avenue. Dana Pruitt was at her desk in the commercial accounts section. The same desk she had occupied for 20 years. Neat and organized the way she kept everything. A small plant on the corner that she had been keeping alive through Ohio winters since before her kids were in high school. She looked up when I came through the glass partition door, and her expression shifted immediately from professional courtesy to something more careful and attentive. She said, "Roy, come in. Sit down." I had called ahead from the car. I had told her only that I needed to discuss something about my accounts, and that it was time-sensitive. She had said, "Come right over." I gave her the short version first. The joint account, the withdrawals, the insurance transfer, the LLC. I put the bank statement on her desk and watched her read it. Dana had been in commercial banking long enough that her face didn't show much when she was processing information. But I could see something moving behind her eyes as she went down the transaction list. She said, "This account, the DS Auto Holdings LLC. Is it registered at this institution?" I said I didn't know. She typed for a moment. She said, "It's not here. It's at a different institution." She looked up. "Roy, I have to be careful about what I can tell you and what I can't, because there are privacy rules I have to follow. But I can tell you this much. The insurance transfer you're describing, changing the named insured on a commercial policy, that requires authorization from the original policyholder, unless there is a valid power of attorney or a court order. Do you have any documentation that you authorized that change?" I said no. She said, "Then you have a legitimate dispute." She paused. She said, "I also want to flag something on my end. The joint account, the one with your name on it. You are a co-holder. That means you have the right to full transaction records and the right to dispute any transaction you did not authorize. I can initiate a formal dispute process from this side and flag the account for review. It won't get your money back immediately, but it creates a record, an official one." I said, "Please do that." She printed several forms. I signed them. She made copies and gave me a set in a folder. Before I left, she looked at me across the desk with the expression of someone who wants to say more than their professional role permits and is finding the right way to do it. She said, "I've known you for 20 years. Roy, you've always been straight with me. Whatever you need from this side of the desk, within what I'm allowed to do, you've got it." I thanked her. I meant it more than I was able to say. I called Arthur Gaines from the parking lot. He answered on the fourth ring, slightly out of breath, the way he always sounded when he'd been out in the yard. He said, "Roy Tillman. It's been a while." "What's going on with that Lincoln?" I said. "Arthur, the Lincoln's fine. I need to talk to you about something else entirely." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How soon can you get to my house?" Arthur Gaines lived in the older part of town, a colonial on a street of colonials with mature oaks out front. He met me at the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. His study was lined with law books he had not packed away after retiring, which I took as a good sign. I sat in the chair across from his desk and told him everything. He listened the way lawyers listen, not reacting, just absorbing, occasionally writing something on a yellow pad of his own. When I finished, he picked up the personal guarantee and read it from the beginning. He read it twice. He set it down. He said, "The joint and several liability clause in the partnership agreement and the personal guarantee together constitute a fairly sophisticated trap. Whoever drafted these documents knew what they were doing. The question is going to be whether your signature on the guarantee was obtained through fraudulent means, specifically whether material information was withheld from you at the time of signing, which from what you're describing, it clearly was," he said. "I want to be honest with you. This isn't going to be fast, and it isn't going to be simple. But you have something a lot of people in your situation don't have." He paused. "You have the paper trail." He said it the way Walt had said Walt's piece, with the weight of a man who understood what he was talking about. I thought about June, about shoeboxes stacked in a hall closet, about a woman who kept receipts not because she expected the worst, but because she understood that the truth needed a place to live. I drove home in the early evening with 3 folders on the passenger seat. One from Walt's advice, one from Dana's desk, one from Arthur's study. The house was still quiet when I walked in. Still the buzzing light, still the shoe boxes in the closet, but something had shifted in the quality of the quiet. It felt less like absence now. It felt more like the stillness before work. Arthur called me on Tuesday morning with a list, not a long list. Arthur was not a man who padded things out. 7 items, he said, and read them to me one at a time in the measured cadence of a man who had spent decades making sure people understood exactly what he was telling them. 7 categories of documentation he needed in order to build what he called a viable challenge to the fraudulent inducement claim. Original signed copies of all agreements, bank records showing the unauthorized withdrawals, the insurance policy change documentation, any correspondence in writing between me and Danny or Sheila regarding the business arrangement, evidence of the LLC formation and its timeline relative to our partnership signing, and witness statements, if I could get them, from anyone who had observed the operation of the shop before and after April. I wrote it all down. Then I went to work. I had the documents from June's shoeboxes already organized on the kitchen table, so that part was mostly done. The bank records were the next piece. Dana had initiated the formal dispute on her end, but I also needed my own copies, certified and complete. I went back to Henderson Avenue on Tuesday afternoon, and Dana walked me through the process of requesting a full certified transaction history for both the joint account and my personal business account going back 18 months. She submitted the request while I sat across from her desk and told me the records would be ready in 2 business days. While I waited for the bank records, I worked on the correspondence piece. I went through my phone carefully. Danny and I had exchanged texts over the past several months, mostly brief, the kind of messages that don't seem like much individually, but which together tell a story of how a relationship has been managed. There were the messages from April around the time of signing, warm and enthusiastic on his end, full of phrases like, "This is going to be great for both of us," and "I just want you to be taken care of, Dad." There were later messages where I had asked about the invoices he had promised, and he had responded with short deflections. "I'll get those to you this week. Been slammed. Talk soon." There were 2 messages from Sheila, both sent from Danny's phone, which I thought was interesting, both of them reiterating the narrative about me needing rest, about how I seemed tired, about how they were just trying to help. I screenshotted everyone and sent them to Arthur. He called back that evening. He said, "These are useful, particularly the pattern of deflection when you asked for documentation. It establishes that you made repeated requests, and they were repeatedly denied, which supports the fraudulent concealment argument." Then I went to see Marcus. I drove to the shop on Wednesday morning and parked a block away. I called Marcus from the car and told him to meet me at the coffee place on the corner of Granger and 5th when he had his lunch break. He was there at 12:15, in his work clothes, smelling of the shop the way the shop always smelled. Motor oil and metal and the particular cleanser we used on the concrete floor. I told him what I needed. Not much, just a written account of what he had told me at the diner. The property assessor, the account number change, the dates he had observed these things. As specific as he could be, he said, "I already wrote it down." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced 3 folded pages, handwritten in careful block letters, dated and signed at the bottom. He said, "I wrote it out the night after I talked to you at the diner. I figured you might need it in that form someday." I looked at him across the small table. I said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "Yes, sir." I did. I thought about what kind of 20-year-old writes out a 3-page witnessed account in block letters the night after a difficult conversation because he figures it might be needed someday. The kind, I thought, who pays attention. The kind who has learned somewhere along the way that doing the right thing sometimes requires doing the work that the right thing demands. Not just feeling the feeling, but taking the action. I took the pages and folded them carefully and put them in my inside jacket pocket. I also went to see 3 regular customers that week. Pete Garland, whose carburetor I had been working on the night Marcus called. Pete had been bringing his vehicles to me for 16 years and had been to the shop enough times that he knew the operation well, knew me by name, knew Danny by name, had observed the change in the shop's atmosphere over the past several months because he had come in for a brake job in September and commented afterward that the place felt different, that there was a new energy he couldn't quite name, but didn't entirely like. I asked Pete if he'd be willing to write down what he'd observed. He said, "Roy, I'll write down whatever you need." He said it the way Walt had said what he'd said, with the simple directness of a man who has already made up his mind about what's right. Connie Marsh, who had been bringing her family's cars to me since her oldest was in diapers, told me she had noticed the shop's hours had changed, and that when she called in September, a woman she didn't recognize had answered the phone and given her a price for a routine service that was $30 higher than what I had always charged. She had not said anything at the time because she didn't know how to raise it without causing trouble. She was glad. She said, to have the opportunity to say it now. And old Gerald Pruitt, Jr., son of the man who had given me my start, who brought in his father's restored Ford pickup twice a year for maintenance, and had watched Tillman's Auto grow from 2 bays to 4 over the course of his adult lifetime. Gerald said quietly, without being asked much, that he had seen a real estate agent's car in the lot on a Tuesday in October, and had wondered about it but not wanted to pry. By Thursday evening, I had a folder that Arthur called, when I brought it to his house, genuinely substantial. He sat at his desk and went through it page by page, the way he had always read documents, with the glasses down on his nose and the particular stillness of a man for whom words on paper have always been serious things. When he finished, he set the folder on the desk, and looked at me over the top of his glasses. He said, "Roy, I want you to understand something. What you have here is not a guarantee. Courts are slow and outcomes are uncertain, and I won't pretend otherwise. But what you have is a record, a real one, built from documents and people who were willing to put their names on what they know." He paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually most of it." I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat where the other folders had been. The kitchen table had changed in the past week. It had started as the place where I ate alone and stared at the buzzing light. Now it was covered in organized stacks, each one labeled in my handwriting, each one representing something that was true and documented and had a witness behind it. I stood at the counter and looked at it. Then I looked at the hall closet. At the plain white envelope still sitting on the shelf where I had moved it after the first night. June's handwriting on the front. Patient and waiting the way she had always been patient. I walked over to the closet. I picked it up. I stood there for a moment with it in my hands. Then I carried it to the table, sat down, and opened it. June's letter was 2 pages, written on the yellow legal paper she used for anything she considered important. She had written it in October of last year, 3 months before she died, in the period when she was still well enough to sit at the kitchen table for an hour at a time, but tired enough that she had started putting things in order. Not in a morbid way, in her way. The way she stacked shoeboxes and labeled envelopes, taking care of the things that needed taking care of while she still could. She wrote about Danny the way she had always spoken about him when it was just the two of us. With love and with clarity, both things at once, not letting one cancel out the other. She said she was afraid of what he might do after she was gone, not out of malice necessarily, but out of weakness, which she had always thought was more dangerous than malice because weakness doesn't know what it is. She said she was afraid that grief and loneliness would make me less careful than I had always been, that I would want so badly for things to be all right, that I would let them appear all right without checking whether they actually were. She said, "Roy, you are the most honest man I have ever known. And sometimes honest men are the easiest ones to deceive because they extend the assumption of honesty to people who have not earned it." She said, "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust the feeling. Don't talk yourself out of it." She said, "The shoe boxes are in the closet. Everything you need is in there." I made sure of it. I sat at the kitchen table with those 2 pages for a long time. I did not cry. I had cried in January and in February, and on some mornings in March when the light came through the bedroom window at the angle it used to come when she was still there, and I had made my peace with crying then. What I felt reading her letter was different from crying. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of being known by someone who is no longer there to know you, which is one of the particular griefs of losing a person who understood you well. She had written this letter 10 months before I signed those papers. She had known, not the specifics, not Danny's gambling or Sheila's scheme, but the shape of the danger, the particular vulnerability she was leaving behind when she left. And she had done what she could about it from where she was. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. I put the envelope in the folder with the rest of the documents. Then the phone rang. It was Sheila. She called on a Friday afternoon, which was not her pattern. She usually communicated through Danny, using him as a buffer the way people use intermediaries when they want distance between themselves and the thing they're actually doing. A direct call from Sheila meant something had changed on her end. Something had made her decide that the buffer wasn't sufficient. Her voice was warm, the specific warmth she produced when she wanted something, layered over something harder and more alert underneath. She said, "Roy, I've been thinking about you. I feel terrible that we haven't had you over for dinner in a few weeks. Things have been so hectic with the business." She paused just long enough. "I wanted to reach out personally and invite you to Sunday dinner at our place. The whole family. Danny's cousin Robert and his wife are coming down from Cleveland. It would be so good for everyone to be together," I said. "That sounds nice." "Sheila," she said, "wonderful. And Roy, I hope you don't mind, but Danny's Aunt Patricia will be there as well. You know how she loves to see you." I knew Aunt Patricia, Danny's mother's sister, a woman in her 70s who had strong opinions about most things and who had known Danny his entire life. I also understood immediately why Sheila was mentioning her. Patricia was not a neutral presence at a family gathering. She was the kind of person whose observations carried weight, whose impressions of a situation became the family's official record of it. Sheila was assembling an audience. I said, "I'll be there." "What time?" After I hung up, I sat at the table and thought about it carefully. The pattern was clear enough. Sheila had been building a narrative for months. The gentle observations about my forgetfulness, the suggestion that I needed rest, the gradual removal of my daily presence at the shop. These were not random. They were the foundation of something, a version of Roy Tillman as a confused, declining old man who needed to be managed for his own good, a version that would be very useful to have on record if there was ever a legal dispute about signatures on documents or unauthorized transfers of business assets. Sunday dinner with Aunt Patricia and Danny's cousin Robert was not a family gathering. It was an evidence-gathering exercise. She needed witnesses who would remember that Roy seemed off, that he repeated himself, that he got confused about simple things. People who could later say, "Now that you mention it, yes, we did notice he seemed to be struggling. We were all so worried about him." I called Arthur that evening. I told him about the invitation and what I thought it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your rate on this is probably right. The question is what you do about it." I said, "I'm going to go." He said, "Roy." I said, "I know. But if I don't go, it confirms the narrative. The difficult, uncooperative old man who isolates himself and refuses family connection. I'd rather be in the room. I'd rather they have to work harder for what they're trying to get." Arthur was quiet again. Then he said, "All right. But listen to me carefully. Do not engage with anything that feels like a test. Do not correct people loudly. Do not get angry. The version of you they want to see is the version that reacts. Give them nothing to work with," I said. "I know how to give people nothing to work with." He said, "I know you do. That's why I'm not arguing harder." I spent Saturday preparing in a different way than I had been preparing all week. Not with documents, with stillness. I sat in the kitchen and I practiced being exactly what I was. A quiet man, attentive, steady, not given to displays. The same man I had been my whole life. The man who listened to engines and let them tell him what was wrong before he decided anything. Sunday came gray and cold the way November Sundays in Ohio always come. I put on my good shirt. I combed my hair. I drove to Danny's house with my hands easy on the wheel and my mind clear and settled in the way that a mind gets clear when it has already decided what it is going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. I rang the doorbell. Sheila answered it with the warmest smile I had ever seen on her face, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she needed the next few hours to go her way. "Come in, Roy," she said. "We're so glad you're here." The house smelled like pot roast and candles and the particular air freshener Sheila used that always reminded me of a hotel lobby. Aunt Patricia was already there when I came in, sitting in the living room armchair with a glass of sweet tea, wearing the kind of holiday sweater she favored. She stood up when she saw me and held my arms and looked at my face the way older women sometimes do when they are trying to determine something without asking directly. She said, "Roy, you look thin." I said, "I'm fine." "Patricia, you look well." Danny's cousin Robert and his wife Linda were on the couch. Robert was in his 40s, a quiet man who worked in insurance and had always seemed slightly uncomfortable at family gatherings, as if he had accepted the invitations under a misapprehension about what they would involve. Linda smiled and said it was good to see me. Sheila moved through the room with the energy of a woman running a production, refilling glasses, adjusting the candles on the dining table, asking everyone if they needed anything in a way that kept her in motion and in control of the room's temperature. Danny stood near the kitchen doorway with a beer he was not really drinking, his eyes moving between his wife and me, with the expression I had come to recognize as his default in situations he had agreed to, but was not entirely comfortable with. We sat down to dinner at 6. The food was good. Sheila was a capable cook when she wanted to be, and tonight she wanted to be. The conversation was the surface kind, comfortable and careful. The way dinner conversation is when the people at the table don't know each other well enough to go deeper, or know each other too well to want to. Robert talked about the drive down from Cleveland. Patricia talked about her neighbor's dog. I talked when I was addressed and listened when I wasn't and kept my face easy and my hands steady and gave them nothing. It was about 40 minutes in when Sheila began. She did it the way she did everything, from the side and by degrees. She mentioned something she said had happened at the shop the previous week. A customer, she said, had called asking about a repair Roy had done on their vehicle back in September. She said the customer had some questions about the work. She said it casually, in the tone of someone raising a small administrative matter. I said, "Who was the customer?" She said she couldn't remember the name offhand. I said, "What were the questions?" She said something vague about the quality of the repair, about the customer feeling uncertain. I said, "I'd need a name to look into that." She nodded and said, "Of course," and changed the subject in the smooth way she changed subjects when the subject had served its purpose. She didn't need to resolve it. She just needed Patricia and Robert to have heard it. 15 minutes later, she mentioned that she had found some paperwork in the shop's office that she wanted to ask me about. Some old invoices that didn't seem to match the current records. She said she'd asked Danny to look into it, but it was confusing. The filing system was a little hard to follow. I had built that filing system in 1991. It was not hard to follow. I said, "I'm happy to go through it with you whenever you'd like." She smiled and said, "That would be great." She said it warmly, as if I had offered something generous. And then she looked briefly at Patricia with the kind of look that is designed to be noticed without appearing designed. Patricia had been watching me steadily throughout dinner. I could feel it. The particular attention of a woman who has been asked to pay attention, though the asking would not have been explicit. Just a conversation beforehand, a concern raised, a seed planted. It was near the end of the meal, when Sheila brought out the pie and the conversation had relaxed slightly, that Danny spoke. He had been quiet most of the evening, quiet in his way, which was the quiet of a man who has positioned himself at a careful distance from something and is maintaining that distance with effort. He set down his fork and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked up at Patricia. He said, "Aunt Patricia, I want to ask your opinion on something. As someone who's known our family a long time." Patricia looked at him. She said, "Of course." He said, "Sheila and I have been worried about Dad for a while now. He's been having some trouble keeping track of things at the shop, some confusion about dates and paperwork. We've been trying to figure out the right way to help him, whether he should maybe step back a little. Let us manage more of the day-to-day. We just want to make sure he's taken care of." He was not looking at me. He was looking at Patricia, and then at Robert, and then at Linda. And he spoke with the measured sincerity of a son burdened by genuine concern, which was a performance. And he knew it was a performance. And he did it anyway. Patricia looked at me. I looked at Danny. I waited for him to meet my eyes. He did not. He picked up his fork and moved a piece of pie crust around his plate, and kept his gaze slightly to the left of my face, close enough to seem like eye contact, far enough to avoid it. He had just told Patricia and Robert and Linda that his father was confused and declining and needed to be managed. He had done it at a dinner table with a pot roast and candles and an air freshener that smelled like a hotel lobby. And he had done it while I sat 4 feet away and could hear every word. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. I said, "Thank you for dinner. Sheila, it was a good meal." I looked at Patricia. I said, "Patricia, it's always good to see you." I looked at Robert and Linda. I said, "Safe drive back to Cleveland." I did not look at Danny again. I walked to the front door, took my coat from the hook, and let myself out into the cold November night. I stood on the porch for a moment and breathed the cold air and let it do what cold air does, which is remind you that you are standing in the actual world and not in the version of it that someone else is trying to construct around you. Then I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off for a moment. The windows fogged slightly from my breath. Through the living room window, I could see the shapes of people still at the table. The warm light, the candles, the ordinary surface of a family dinner that was not what it appeared to be. Danny had made his choice. He had made it in front of witnesses, cleanly and deliberately, and there would be no walking it back. Not because I wouldn't allow it, but because the man who could sit 4 feet from his father and say those words without meeting his eyes had already become someone a different kind of walking back was possible for. I started the engine. I drove home in the dark, with my hands steady on the wheel and the particular clarity that comes when you have stopped hoping for something and can finally see the situation as it actually is. I got home at 8:15 and sat in the parked car in the driveway for a while. Not a long while, maybe 5 minutes. Long enough to let the evening settle into its proper shape before I took it inside with me. The light over the garage was on. It was always on. I looked at it the way I had been looking at it since January. That particular square of yellow light that June had left burning and that I had kept burning without deciding to. The way you keep doing certain things after a person is gone because stopping feels like a second loss, and you're not ready for a second loss. I thought about Danny at that dinner table. The way he had talked about me to Patricia and Robert and Linda while I sat close enough to hear every word. Not in anger or desperation, the way a person might say something they later regret, but in the measured tone of a man presenting a case he had prepared. A son who had looked at his father and decided that what his father represented was a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be explained away, a narrative to be established before the paperwork caught up with him. I thought about June's letter. The honest men are the easiest ones to deceive. I had been honest. I had been decent. I had treated people well for 63 years because it was the right way to live, not because I expected anything back. And someone had looked at that decency and seen a target. That was the thing I sat with for those 5 minutes in the driveway. Then I got out of the car and went inside. I hung up my coat. I changed out of my good shirt. I made a pot of coffee even though it was evening and I knew it would keep me up, because some nights you need to be kept up. I sat at the kitchen table with the organized folders in front of me and the legal pad beside them, and I let myself feel what I felt, which is different from drowning in it. I felt grief. Real grief. The specific kind that comes when you stop hoping a thing will be different and accept what it actually is. I had been grieving June for almost a year. This was a different grief, quieter in some ways and sharper in others. The grief of a father who has finished hoping his son will be the person he raised him to be and has accepted the person he actually is. I sat with that grief for maybe half an hour. Then I picked up the phone and called Arthur. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the dinner. All of it. The pot roast and the candles, and the carefully casual insinuations and Danny's speech to Patricia about his confused, declining father. Arthur listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence. He said, "That dinner was a mistake for them." I said, "How so?" He said, "Because now they have witnesses to an active campaign to establish your incompetence. That's a double-edged thing, Roy. It can be used to support their narrative, yes, but it can also be used to demonstrate a pattern of coordinated behavior designed to undermine your legal standing before a dispute. The question is, which framing gets to a judge first?" He paused. "I think it's time to move. Not tomorrow, but soon. Within the week," I said. "I think so too." He said he would draw up the formal fraud complaint and the motion to invalidate the personal guarantee on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. He said Dana's certified bank records had arrived, and she had forwarded them to him, and that Marcus's written statement plus the accounts from Pete and Connie and Gerald gave him the witness foundation he needed. He said, "Roy, I want to be straight with you. We are not going into a courtroom to get rich. We are going in to get your house and your shop back and to put on the record what actually happened. That's the goal." I said, "That's all I want." He said, "Good. Because that's what we can get." I called Walt after I hung up with Arthur. Walt picked up and I told him we were moving, and when, he said, "I'll be there." Simple as that. No questions, no conditions. Just, "I'll be there." I called Dana the next morning when the branch opened. She said the formal dispute she had filed on my behalf had been escalated to the bank's fraud review department, which was exactly where Arthur had said it needed to go. She said the review would not be fast, but it was official and documented and would be part of the record. She said, "Roy, for what it's worth, I hope this goes the way it should." I thanked her and meant it and hung up. I spent Monday and Tuesday going through the folders one more time with Arthur at his kitchen table. The two of us working through the documents in the methodical way that old men who respect paperwork work through things, checking each item against the list, making sure nothing was out of order, nothing missing, nothing that could be challenged on procedural grounds. On Tuesday evening, Arthur looked up from the folders and said, "We're ready." I looked at the table. 35 years of a business. 12 months of a scheme laid out in documents and dates and names. The testimony of ordinary people who had nothing to gain and had chosen to tell the truth anyway. June's shoeboxes, which had turned out to be exactly what she had always said they were. The place where the truth lived when you needed it. I thought about what she had written. Everything you need is in there. I made sure of it. She had known. 10 months before the papers were signed, and 18 months before I sat at this table with a folder that Arthur called genuinely substantial. June Tillman had known that her husband might need the truth in a retrievable form, and she had made sure it was there. I sat at the table for a long time after Arthur went to bed. The house was quiet. The buzzing light was buzzing the way it had been buzzing since August. I looked at it for a moment. Then I got up, went to the junk drawer, and found a new bulb. I changed it. The kitchen got brighter. Not dramatically brighter. Just enough. Just the difference between a room where something has been slightly wrong for a long time and a room where that particular thing is finally right. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went to bed and slept better than I had in months. Arthur had chosen a Thursday morning. Not for any dramatic reason. Thursday because the bank's fraud review department had confirmed they could have a compliance officer present, and Arthur wanted an institutional witness in the room who was not connected to either side. Thursday because Marcus had that morning off from the shop. Thursday because Walt said any day worked for him, and Roy should just tell him when. The meeting was at Arthur's house. Not a courthouse. Not a conference room. Not a setting designed to intimidate. Arthur's study, with the law books on the shelves and the oak desk and the window looking out onto the street with the mature trees. Arthur said he had chosen it deliberately. He said, "Roy, we are not prosecuting a case. We are presenting a truth. A living room is the right room for that." I arrived at 8:30. Walt was already there, sitting in the chair by the window in his canvas vest, coffee in hand, looking like a man who has been waiting comfortably and could wait considerably longer if needed. The compliance officer from the bank, a woman named Helen Torres, who wore a gray suit and carried a briefcase and had the careful eyes of someone whose job was to find things that didn't add up, was at the table reviewing documents Arthur had sent her the day before. Arthur had called Danny on Wednesday evening. He had not said much. He had identified himself as Roy Tillman's legal representative and said that there were some documents regarding the April partnership agreement and subsequent business activities that required Danny's attention, and that Roy had requested a meeting at 10 o'clock Thursday morning at the address he then provided. He said it in the tone of a retired lawyer who has seen enough to know that the simpler you make an invitation, the harder it is to refuse without revealing that you know what the invitation is actually about. Danny said he would be there. He arrived at 10 with Sheila beside him. I heard the car pull up from where I was sitting in Arthur's study. I heard the doors close. I heard their footsteps on the porch. 2 sets. Which meant Sheila had decided she needed to be present. Which meant she had spent the evening preparing for whatever she expected to walk into. Arthur opened the door. He shook Danny's hand and nodded to Sheila and showed them both into the study. Danny saw me first. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, his eyes moving from my face to Walt's, and then to Helen Torres at the table, and then to the folders spread across Arthur's desk. I watched the calculation move across his face, the rapid assessment of what he was looking at and what it meant, and whether there was a version of this he could still manage. There wasn't. But he didn't know the full dimensions of that yet. Sheila came in behind him. She scanned the room the way she always scanned rooms, quickly and completely. And I saw the moment her eyes landed on the folders and the compliance officer and understood the combination. Her expression didn't change. She was better at that than Danny. She sat down and folded her hands on the table and waited. Arthur sat at his desk. He did not open with pleasantries. He said, "I've asked you here because Roy has some concerns about several transactions and documents related to the partnership agreement signed in April. I'd like to go through them, and I'd like you to have the opportunity to respond." Danny said, "Of course." His voice was careful, controlled. Arthur opened the first folder. He laid out the bank statement showing the $38,000 in withdrawals from the joint account. He placed it on the table and slid a copy across to Danny and Sheila. He said, "These withdrawals were made over a 5-week period. Roy did not authorize any of them." "Can you explain the nature of these transactions?" Danny said. "Those were operational expenses for the new location build-out." "We discussed this," Arthur said. "Do you have documentation for those expenses, contractor agreements, invoices, receipts?" Danny said. "Sheila handles the paperwork side." Arthur looked at Sheila. Sheila said, "The documentation is at the office," Arthur said. "We requested that documentation 3 weeks ago. It has not been provided." He placed a copy of the text message exchange on the table, the thread where I had asked Danny for invoices 6 separate times and received 6 deferrals. He said, "This is the request history." Sheila looked at the papers. Something moved behind her eyes, a rapid recalculation. Arthur opened the second folder, the insurance policy change. He laid the 2 versions side by side. The March renewal listing, Roy Tillman, DBA Tillman's Auto, and the September renewal listing, DS Auto Holdings, LLC. He said, "This change was made without Roy's knowledge or authorization. Helen, would you like to speak to the banking dimension of this?" Helen Torres opened her briefcase. She said, "DS Auto Holdings, LLC opened a commercial account at a competing institution in March of this year, 2 months before the partnership agreement was signed." She placed a document on the table. "This is a matter of public business registration record. The LLC was formed in February." She paused to let that land. The partnership agreement was signed in April. Danny's jaw moved slightly. Sheila did not move at all. Arthur opened the third folder. Marcus's written statement, Pete Garland's account, Connie Marsh, Gerald Pruitt Jr., 4 ordinary people, their names at the bottom of 4 separate pages, describing what they had seen and when. And then Arthur laid down the personal guarantee. He placed it in the center of the table. He said, "This document bears Roy's signature." It was apparently signed on the same day as the partnership agreement. Roy has no memory of signing it and was not informed of its existence or its terms. He placed beside it a 1-page summary Arthur had prepared of the fraudulent inducement argument, clean and plainly worded. He said, "This constitutes the basis of a formal legal challenge which I have already filed with the county court." The filing date was yesterday. The room was quiet. Danny looked at the personal guarantee for a long moment. He looked like a man reading something he had hoped would never appear in this form, in this room, in this particular arrangement of documents and people. Sheila looked at it too. Then she looked up, not at Arthur, at me, and the warmth that had been her operating mode for months, the patient sweetness and the careful concern and the smile she produced when she wanted something. All of it left her face at once, the way heat leaves a room when a door opens onto winter. She said, This is a negotiation. Whatever you think you have here, this is a negotiation, and we can find a way to resolve this without going further. I looked at her. I said, no. Just that word. No. The way you say no when you have thought about it long enough that the word doesn't need anything attached to it. Sheila's expression changed again, this time into something I had not seen from her before. Not the calculation or the warmth or the predatory patience. Something rawer and less managed. The look of a person who has built a plan around a particular version of you and is meeting, for the first time, the actual version. Sheila stood up. She did it slowly. The way people stand when they are buying time, when the body needs a moment that the mind hasn't finished with yet. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She looked at Helen Torres, and then at Arthur, and then at Walt, sitting quietly by the window. And I could see her working through the room, assessing each person, looking for the angle that was still available to her. There wasn't one. But she was not a woman who accepted that conclusion without testing it. She said, "Whatever Roy has told you, there are two sides to this situation. We have been managing a very difficult family dynamic for months. Roy has been struggling since June passed. We have documentation of our own, medical opinions, observations from family members." She said it in the tone she used when she was most confident, the tone that had worked in every room she had ever walked into, smooth and authoritative and pitched just slightly above the conversation around it. Arthur said, "We'd be glad to review any documentation you have." He said it calmly. He placed a hand on the folder to his left. "In the meantime, I'd like to draw your attention to one more item." He opened the folder and produced a single printed page. It was a copy of the DS Auto Holdings LLC formation documents, the original filing with the state. He placed it on the table next to the September insurance policy change. He said, "The LLC was filed in February. The partnership agreement Roy signed was in April. The insurance policy was changed in September to list the LLC as the named insured." He paused. "What this timeline shows is that the entity you were planning to transfer Roy's business assets into existed before Roy agreed to any partnership. The partnership agreement was not the beginning of a joint venture. It was a mechanism for transferring assets into a structure that was already prepared to receive them." Helen Torres said, "From the bank's perspective, the commercial account opened under DS Auto Holdings in March, combined with the pattern of withdrawals from the joint account, constitutes sufficient grounds for a formal fraud investigation." She said it without emphasis, the way accountants deliver conclusions, as if the numbers had simply arranged themselves into the only shape they could honestly take. Danny had not spoken since Arthur laid out the personal guarantee. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the document in front of him. And I watched something happen to his face over the course of that silence that I had not seen happen to it since he was very young. The performance of it fell away. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. The way a structure gives way when the thing holding it up is no longer there. He looked like the boy who had stood in my garage at 8 years old learning to change a tire. He looked like someone who was a very long way from where he had started and was only now calculating the full distance. Sheila turned toward him. She said, "Danny." She said it with a sharpness that cut across everything else in the room. She needed him back in the position he had been in all morning, which was the position she required him to occupy, the one where he was beside her and not looking at his father. He did not look at her. He looked at the table. She said his name again, sharper, He said, "Quiet." Just that. Quiet. The way a person says a word when they have been holding it back for a very long time and have finally stopped holding it. Sheila's breath changed. I heard it, a slight catch, the sound of a person recalibrating rapidly. She turned back to Arthur. She said, "We need to discuss this with our own attorney before we respond to any of these claims." "This meeting is over," Arthur said. "Of course. You're not obligated to stay." He said it pleasantly. He placed a copy of the court filing in front of her. "This is the case number and the preliminary hearing date. You'll want to share it with your attorney." Sheila picked it up without looking at it. She reached for her bag. Danny said, "Where did the money go?" "Megan." The name came out wrong. He caught it immediately, his face tightening. He said, "Sheila." He said it again. "Where did the money go?" She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite fear, and was something that contained elements of both. She said, "I handled it." He said, "You handled it." $43,000 that he guaranteed without knowing it. $38,000 out of a joint account in 5 weeks. You handled it. He was not raising his voice. He was using the tone of a man who has been avoiding a conversation for a long time and has run out of room to keep avoiding it. She said, "Danny." "Not here." He said, "Where then?" He looked up at her. He said, "We used him. Sheila, we used my father." He said the last 2 words in a way that made it clear he was hearing them fully for the first time. Not as an abstract concept or a strategic decision, but as a fact about himself, about what he had done and allowed and agreed to. Sheila said, "We did what we had to do to survive." He said, "He would have helped us. If we had asked him, he would have helped." The room was very quiet. I did not say anything. I sat at that table, and I let my son arrive at the truth on his own. Because some things cannot be handed to a person. They have to be walked to. Sheila put her bag over her shoulder. She said, "I'll be in the car." She walked out of the room with the particular precision of a woman who is maintaining her composure through sheer force of will and knows the composure has an expiration on it. The front door opened and closed. Danny sat for another moment. He did not look at me. He looked at the table, at the folders, at the legal pad Arthur had been writing on, at the organized evidence of what had been done and how and when. Then he looked up. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me since he was a boy. Directly. Without the sideways quality that had been in his gaze for months. The quality of a person managing the distance between themselves and something they do not want to fully see. He said, "Dad." Just that. One word. Not an apology exactly. Not anything that could be called sufficient for what it was attached to. Just my name in the form that meant he was my son, offered across a table covered in the documentation of everything he had done and allowed and failed to prevent. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I know." Walt shifted in his chair by the window. Helen Torres made a quiet note. Arthur sat with his hands folded on the desk. The November light came through the window onto the oak floor in long, pale rectangles. The same light it always was at this time of year. Cold and clear and without opinion about the things that happened in the rooms it entered. I picked up my copy of the court filing and folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I stood up. The preliminary hearing was on a Tuesday morning in December. 3 weeks after Arthur's study. I wore the same good shirt I had worn to Sunday dinner at Danny's house, not for any symbolic reason, just because it was my good shirt, and this was an occasion that deserved it. Arthur represented me. The county courthouse on Main Street was not a dramatic building. It was a practical one, brick and fluorescent lit. The kind of place where ordinary people brought ordinary disputes and asked a system to tell them what was true. I had never been inside it before that morning. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench while Arthur conferred with the judge's clerk, and I looked at the other people waiting on other benches with other folders, and I thought about how many quiet, ordinary disasters were moving through that building on any given Tuesday. Sheila had retained a lawyer. He was younger than Arthur and wore a better suit and spoke with the confidence of a man who had been told he was formidable often enough to believe it. He presented their response to Arthur's filing, which argued that the personal guarantee had been legitimately executed and that the business transactions in question represented standard partnership operations. Arthur presented the timeline: the LLC formation in February, the partnership agreement in April, the insurance transfer in September, the withdrawal pattern, Helen Torres's affidavit, Marcus's statement, Pete and Connie and Gerald, the text message record of 6 unanswered requests for documentation. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and the particular patience of someone who has heard many versions of many stories and has learned to look for the ones that are supported by paper. She looked at the paper. The personal guarantee was invalidated on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. The partnership agreement was suspended pending further review. The LLC's claim to the shop's insurance and supplier accounts was frozen. Roy M. Tillman, DBA Tillman's Auto, was restored as the sole named party on all business accounts and assets pending the outcome of the full proceeding. It took 40 minutes. Sheila did not look at me when the judge read the ruling. She looked at her lawyer, then at the table, then at a point somewhere past the left side of the room. Danny was not there. He had not retained his own counsel. He had not shown up to contest anything. What he had done, Arthur told me the week before, was move out of the house on Clearfield Road. He was staying, apparently, at Robert's place in Cleveland. I thought about that on the drive home. Danny in Cleveland. Danny away from the house on Clearfield Road. Away from the imported furniture and the candles and the air freshener that smelled like a hotel lobby. I did not feel satisfaction about it. I did not feel much of anything about it, except a kind of sadness that had already been present for long enough that I had learned to carry it without it stopping me. Sheila faced a separate process. The bank's fraud investigation, which Helen Torres had initiated formally after the Thursday meeting at Arthur's house, had expanded beyond the joint account withdrawals. The insurance transfer, executed using Sheila's credentials from her employer's partner institution, had drawn the attention of the bank's compliance division. Dana told me, carefully and within the limits of what she was permitted to say, that the matter had been referred to the state's financial crimes unit. I did not follow the details of that closely. Arthur kept me informed of what I needed to know. The rest of it was not my business to manage. What happened to Sheila would happen through its own process, in its own time. in rooms I did not need to be in. What I needed to do was go home. I pulled into the driveway on the Tuesday afternoon after the hearing. The light over the garage was on. The new bulb I had put in 2 weeks before, clean and bright the way it had not been since summer. I sat in the car for a moment looking at it. I went inside and put the kettle on. While I waited for it, I went to the hall closet. The shoeboxes were still there. Most of them. The ones I had not needed to pull out. I stood in front of them for a moment. Then I reached up to the shelf above them and took down a small object I had placed there in January and had not moved since. It was a photograph in a frame. June and me on the porch of this house the summer we moved in, 1993. She was laughing at something. Her head turned slightly toward me, and I was looking at her the way I looked at her for 38 years, with the particular attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at was the best thing in his life. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the windowsill where the blue pitcher used to hold the yellow roses. The kettle began to whistle. I thought about her letter. The honest men are the easiest ones to deceive. And the other thing she had written, the thing I had been returning to since the night I read it. She had written, "Roy, your decency is not a weakness. Don't let anyone, and I mean anyone, convince you that the way you have chosen to live has made you less. It has made you more. It has made you the kind of man that people come to when things go wrong, because they know you will do what is right even when it costs you something. That is not nothing. That is everything." I poured the tea. I stood at the window with the mug in my hand and the photograph on the sill and the bare rose bush along the fence going into its winter rest, and I thought about what she had known about me. This woman who had kept shoeboxes of receipts and written a letter 10 months before she needed to, and left it in a box labeled miscellaneous documents, because she understood that the truth needed a place to live. She had known I would be all right, not because I was powerful or wealthy or connected to people who could solve problems with a phone call, but because I was patient and honest, and I paid attention, and I kept the paperwork, and I had spent 63 years treating people decently, and some of those people, when it mattered, had been willing to sit in a study or write 3 pages in block letters, or stand up in front of a compliance officer and say what they knew. That was the thing she had been counting on. Not my resources, my character. I looked at her face in the photograph for a long time. Then I set the mug down, put on my coat, and drove to Granger Street. I parked in front of Tillman's auto and sat looking at it through the windshield. The sign was still there, the same one I had put up in '92, white letters on a blue background. The paint faded in the places where the sun hit it hardest. The locks on the front door had been restored to the original by order of the court injunction 2 weeks before. The same locks that had been there since I installed them. I reached into my coat pocket. My key was there. The worn one, smooth on the side where my thumb always rested. I got out of the car. I walked to the front door. I put the key in the lock. It turned. I opened the shop on a Wednesday, not with ceremony, not with a ribbon cutting or a sign in the window or a post on the internet. I unlocked the front door at 7 in the morning, the way I had unlocked it for 35 years. Turned on the lights, started the coffee, and pulled up the bay doors to let the cold December air move through the space the way it always moved through in winter, carrying the smell of frost and motor oil and the particular cold metal scent of a garage that has been waiting for work. Marcus was there at 7:15. He had called the night before and asked if he should come in. I said yes. He showed up with his work boots already laced and a thermos of coffee his mother had sent. Because his mother was the kind of woman who sent thermoses of coffee with her son when he went somewhere important. We didn't talk much that first morning. There wasn't much that needed saying. We moved through the shop the way mechanics move through a familiar space, checking what needed checking, setting things back in the order they belonged, doing the quiet work of restoration that doesn't announce itself, but changes the character of a place the way a room changes when you open the windows after a long winter. Carl came back the following week. I called him on a Thursday evening and told him his Sunday arrangement still stood, that nothing about it had changed on my end, and that if he wanted to come back, I would be glad to have him. He said he'd be there Monday morning. He was there at 6:50, 10 minutes early, the way he had always been. Pete Garland brought his truck in before Christmas. He sat in the waiting area with a coffee from the machine and read a magazine and didn't make a thing of it, which was exactly right. The full legal proceeding took until February to conclude. I will not walk through all of it because most of it was paperwork and waiting rooms, and Arthur explaining things in the patient way he explained things. And the details of that process belong to Arthur and to the court record, and not particularly to this story. What I will say is that the outcome was what Arthur had said it could be. The personal guarantee was permanently invalidated. The fraudulent inducement finding was on the record. The $38,000 from the joint account was the subject of a civil judgment in my favor, which meant that recovering it would take time and might never be complete. Because civil judgments are only as good as the assets available to satisfy them, and Danny's assets were not what they had appeared to be. The bank's investigation of Sheila concluded in the spring. I know this from Dana, who told me as much as she was permitted to tell me, which was not much but was enough. Sheila was terminated from her position. The State Financial Crimes Unit referred the matter to the appropriate authorities. What happened after that is part of a public record that anyone can look up if they want to. And I am not interested in describing it further than that. She had made her choices. The choices had consequences. That is how it is supposed to work. And in this case, it did. Danny and I have not spoken since the morning in Arthur's study, when he said Dad and I said I know. I have thought about whether that is the right outcome, and I have not arrived at a clear answer. He was my son for 38 years before he was the man who sat at a dinner table and told Aunt Patricia that his father was confused and declining. Both of those things are true, and I hold them both without knowing exactly what to do with the combination. Maybe someday there will be a conversation. Maybe there won't. I have stopped needing it to go a particular way. What I know is that I cannot carry his choices for him, and I am not willing to pay the cost of pretending I have forgotten what those choices were. What I have instead of that conversation is the shop. I have the 7 o'clock mornings and the coffee machine in the waiting area, and Carl's truck in the lot by 6:50, and Marcus asking questions about things he doesn't know yet, and the steady accumulation of work that needs doing, and people who trust me to do it right. I have Pete Garland's truck, and Connie Marsh's minivan, and Gerald Pruitt's father's restored Ford pickup that comes in twice a year and always leaves the way it should. I have Walt, who calls on Tuesdays and complains about his knee and asks how things are going, and Dana, who nods at me across the commercial accounts desk with the nod of a person who knows something real about you and respects you for it, and Arthur, who I pay in oil changes now because he refused to accept anything else and I found that acceptable. I have the photograph on the kitchen windowsill. June laughing on the porch in the summer of '93. I look at it every morning when I make the coffee and I think about what she left me. Not just the shoe boxes and the letter and the carefully organized proof that the truth existed and could be found, but the longer thing, the example of how to live in a way that accumulates something real, quietly, without display, in the choices you make when no one is keeping score. She used to say that the way you treated people when you had nothing to gain from treating them well was the truest thing about you. She said you could know a person's whole character from that one observation if you were patient enough to make it. I have thought about that a lot this past year. I think she was right. I think most things that are true are quiet and do not announce themselves and are only visible to the person who is paying attention. I think the things worth building in a life are the things that hold up under pressure, not because they were constructed to be impressive, but because they were constructed honestly, with good materials and real care, and the understanding that shortcuts have a way of becoming the place where everything fails. I am 63 years old. I have a shop on Granger Street and a house on Elm and a photograph on a windowsill and a key that fits the lock on my front door. I did not get here by being powerful. I got here by being careful and patient and decent to the people around me, and by keeping the paperwork, which sounds small until the day it isn't small at all. If you are listening to this and you are carrying something heavy, some weight that someone else put on you when you were not looking, when you were tired or grieving or just trying to believe the best about the people you loved, I want you to know something. The weight is not yours to keep. It was placed there by someone who counted on you not looking closely enough. And looking closely, doing the slow, patient work of seeing things as they actually are and responding to what is actually true, is not beyond you. It was not beyond me. The shop opens at 7. I will be there.